While we were having this discussion on Capitol Hill, just outside the building here, Senator Cory Booker is taken to the Senate floor and is currently engaged in what essentially is a disruption of the Senate business because, in his view, our nation is in crisis. Let's take a quick listen in on Senator Cory Booker.
Started receiving Medicaid. Even with her master's degree, my daughter is only able to work 19 hours a week. Therefore, insurance is not provided. Medicaid is a necessity to maintain her physical and emotional health and provide services to assist with her independence so she can continue to be a contributing member of society. By withdrawing funding for Medicaid, the policy would disrupt programs serving.
This is going on. Senator Cory Booker is looking to stake a claim in the Senate in its business. This could go on for a while. A mini filibuster. I won't officially call it that because I don't know if that's where this ends. What are your thoughts here? Showing. Look, let's lay out for the nation what's at stake here.
I think if more of this is better. I think this is something probably they should have been doing earlier if they have not been doing it. I think they should be doing more of the town halls. I think that they need to be getting out there and explaining to people what is happening and on so many different levels. Particularly, I mean, my focus is on the rule of law. Mm-hmm. Regardless of the substance of the things that Senator Booker is talking about, these things are being done contrary to statutes and contrary to and being done where the president is essentially usurping Congress's power to enact laws, which is why they should be out there speaking loudly and saying, we pass these laws and you come to us if you want to change them. And that, to me, but the point is, though, there are so many ways that all of these things that, illegal as they are, even apart from the illegality, are affecting people. They have the right to be heard on that through their elected representatives, and that's also the point to our tripartite division of powers and the separation of powers in the Constitution.
All right. Well, we will keep an eye on Senator Cory Booker's stand in the Senate to disrupt the Senate because our nation is in crisis.
So, yeah, Donald Trump wanted to change the subject right now and get the attention off of this massively embarrassing screw-up involving the highest-ranking officials in his administration. So in some ways, it wasn't really that surprising when Donald Trump picked up the phone this weekend and called NBC's Kristen Welker. In that conversation, he said he was pissed at Vladimir Putin. Okay. He threatened Russia with tariffs. He threatened Iran with tariffs. He threatened to bomb Iran. And he refused to rule out military action to annex Greenland. It's kind of like he had a note card or a Post-it or something with a list of big shiny objects, and he wanted to cover Russia, Iran, Greenland, bombing something, and he just ticked right through them. And then there was also an exchange in that interview with Kristen about perhaps the shiniest object of all, the blatantly unconstitutional prospect of Trump serving a third term in office. Before I show you exactly what Donald Trump told Kristen Welker about that, and I'll read through the whole transcript for you, I want to show you what he said about it in the past, because that matters too.
I said at a speech recently, I said, watch, we'll drive the media crazy. Let's go for a third term and then a fourth.
Hashtag third term, hashtag fourth term. You'll drive them totally crazy. And then after that, we'll go for another 4 years because, you know what, they spied on my campaign. We should get a redo of 4 years. Based on the way we were treated, we're probably entitled to another 4 after that. I think I'm not allowed to run again. I'm not sure. Am I allowed to run again, Mike? I better not get you involved in that. And I do that despite the fact that they say I can't run again. That's the expression, sir. Then somebody said, I don't think you can. Oh. And they tell me I'm not allowed to run. I'm not sure. Is that true? I'm not sure. Should I run again? You tell me.
Point is, he's talked about this a lot in the past. My bet is that other times when he wanted to change the subject. And yeah, they've sounded like jokes, how unfunny it all is, after all. And with all of that, being said and all that background, here's what he told Kristen Welker over the weekend. I'm just going to read from the part of the transcript when he talked about the blatantly unconstitutional prospect of serving a third term in office. So here goes. Trump, a lot of people want me to do it, but my thinking is, we have a long way to go. I'm focused on the current. Welker, have you been presented with any potential plans that would allow you to serve a third term? Trump, well, there are plans. There are not plans. There are methods which you could do it, as you know. Welker, well, let me throw out one where President Vance would run for office and then would basically, if he won at the top of the ticket, would then pass the baton to you. Trump, well, that's one, but there are others too. There are others too. There are others? Well, that's Welker. Welker now. There are others. There are others? Can you tell me another? Trump, no. Welker, okay. So, but sir, I'm hearing you don't sound like you're joking. I've heard you joke about this a number of times. Trump, no, I'm not joking. I'm not joking. He said he wasn't joking. He said it twice. And here he is in the Oval Office just a couple of hours ago.
People are asking me to run, and there's a whole story about running for a third term. I don't know. I never looked into it. They do say there's a way you can do it, but I don't know about that, but I have not looked into it.
Again, decide for yourself how serious you think he is. And decide for yourself how serious his buddy Steve Bannon has sounded over the past few months.
Maybe we do it again in 28. Are you guys down for that? Trump 28!
I do believe that the Constitution is some lawyers I talk is a little open to that. I think it'd be terrific if President Trump is the candidate in 2028, and I would work for that. If we can figure it out, why wouldn't we?
I am a firm believer that President Trump will run and win again in 2028.
You know he's term limited. How do you think he gets another term?
We're working on it. I think we'll have a couple of alternatives. Let's say that.
Let's say that. Again, decide for yourself. The Constitution explicitly prohibits it. And again, he wants us to talk about anything other than the signal debacle. And I promised you we're going to talk about that tonight, too. Or, frankly, the too close for comfort special election in Florida happening tomorrow, where Democrat Josh Weil, who we will also talk with later on the show, is polling ahead of the Republican candidate in a seat that Trump won by 30 points. He doesn't want to be seen as someone losing political power or losing control of his team, for that matter. I get all of that. Here's what I would also say about the distraction piece of this. We can walk and chew gum. We have to walk and chew gum. We can and should talk about all of it. And we will talk about all of it tonight. But let me just throw a couple of things out there for you to consider about this third term stuff. First is Donald Trump isn't exactly someone who is guided by what the Constitution allows for. We all know that. He tried rolling back birthright citizenship, which flies in the face of the 14th Amendment. He and Elon Musk have basically stolen Congress's spending power, which disregards Article 1. He has detained legal permanent residents and shipped people to El Salvador without trials or formal charges, completely ignoring the Fifth Amendment. So if there's been one lesson, there's been many, but if there's one big lesson since Donald Trump took office again, it's that he's tried to follow through on just about every illegal, unconstitutional thing that he said he would try. He said he was going to do all of this stuff, and he has tried to do all of this stuff. The courts have pushed back every step of the way, but he's tried, and that's all in the last couple of months. Should we go back like tiny bit further? Because remember, this is the same guy who tried to overthrow the government when he lost the presidential election in 2020. It's the same guy who had a detailed plan to overturn the will of the people with fake electors, and when that didn't work, he sent a violent mob to the Capitol. Do you really think that guy cares about the 22nd Amendment and what it says? Really think that guy won't try anything to stay in power? Look, I'm not saying he has an actual path here, and whatever path he might see could get stopped in any number of ways. What I'm saying is that we have every reason to believe he might try. And trying is bad enough. Even talking about it is bad enough. So no, we can't let him get off the topics that warrant discussion, and we won't. But we also have to be prepared for what he might do.
Tesla takedowns popped up across the country and here in Western Washington. Linwood, University Village, Soto, South Lake Union, Fife, Bellevue, and beyond.
All the way from Linwood down to Vancouver, Washington, we just rocked it today. It was a great day.
At the U Village protest,
I am so proud to represent you.
Representative Pramila Jayapal was among those to address the demonstrators.
Musk and the Department of Greed and Evil, that's what DOGE is, the Department of Greed and Evil, have got to go.
In Washington state this weekend, Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal did turn up at an anti-Elon Musk, anti-Trump Tesla takedown rally in her district in Seattle. There were hundreds of these all over the country this weekend. In the midst of this rising tide of Americans who are angry and fearful about what's happening in Trump's second term in office, Americans increasingly willing to stand up and do something about it, Congresswoman Jayapal has also started hosting events that are designed to teach the strategy and tactics of nonviolent resistance and protest. These movements have sort of taken off on their own. She's getting specific for how to do training, practical training on how these things work, how they stay nonviolent, and how they can be most strategically effective. She's calling them resistance labs. The first one was a week and a half ago. Congresswoman Jayapal told a local radio station, quote, "We thought we'd have a couple hundred people. We had 850 people sign up. We had to stop people from registering because we didn't know if we had room." In the end, a crowd of about 500 people packed the building for that first in-person training. They ended up having to turn people away because they couldn't fit them in.
It appears that the Trump administration is willing to ignore judicial decisions. And so that brings us to you in this room. It brings us to the people. That is really the bulwark, the wall against the crumbling of democracy. There's really no other savior or option than the people.
This weekend, Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal decided she would hold a follow-up, a second so-called resistance lab. The Congresswoman says more than 1,500 people took part in the follow-up event this weekend. Not just people who are constituents, not just people from Washington state. She says it was 1,500 people in 31 different states. Joining us now is Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal, Democrat from the great state of Washington. Congresswoman, it's really nice to see you. Thanks very much for being here.
Thank you for having me, Rachel.
Help me understand this idea of the resistance lab and what you're talking about in practical terms at these events.
Yeah, I mean, what we decided is that we really need to help Americans understand what happens when democracies fall, when dictators take over. We've been pretty complacent in America. We haven't had to really deal with this in any real way. And now I think people need to understand what are the lessons from other countries. And working with experts who have studied democratic backsliding in countries around the world and the resistance movements that emerged to take on that democratic backsliding, we've developed a curriculum where we help people understand how do you go after the pillars of support, not necessarily the person at the top, but the pillars of support that allow that person to continue to have power. And how do you shift allies from being sort of passive opponents to being active supporters of taking down a dictatorship? And so it's been very practical. It's been very hands-on. We've taken the principles of Dr. King's, the 6 principles of nonviolent resistance. That is threaded throughout. And we're going to have a second training that goes deeper into what happens if you are trying to do nonviolent protest, but others are coming and instituting violence on you. Think of church basements across Selma, right, Rachel? All the training that went into preparing people. And at the end of the day, we are plugging people in both to actions that are happening right now in their locale that they can get engaged in, but also preparing them for the moments that will come of coordinated resistance, whether it's distributed action or mass action, that people need to be ready for. And we're increasing the understanding, which also increases the ability for people to think about taking more risk, perhaps, than they might have otherwise, because that level of risk tolerance goes up based on how severe people think things are. So we're really readying us for those big moments that we hope don't come, but certainly look like that is the direction that we're headed.
I feel like this is a really important categorical shift that you're talking about. I feel like over these last 71 days and into the transition, a lot of what we've seen, a lot of the organizing that we've seen has essentially been consciousness raising about how bad it is about what is at stake, about how people are being hurt, about what is dangerous, hurtful, potentially irreversible about what's happening. It's all been sounding the alarm. What you are talking about here and what these trainings are about sort of assume that people get that, but now need to talk about, in practical terms, well, what's the most effective way to respond to that? It's not necessarily that people need to know the latest bad thing that Trump is doing. People have now heard enough and they understand enough about what the risk is here that it's time to get practical about what to do in response. I want to ask, given that sort of curriculum that you're describing, how replicable is it? Is this something that has to happen in person? Is this something that can happen in large format settings? Is this something that should only happen in small groups? What's the means of transmitting this curriculum and its lessons?
Yeah, that's the other thing. We have created modules so it can be replicated. I'm offering it, of course, to my colleagues here in Congress, but we're also really testing this model. The first one was in person, as you said. The second one on Sunday was delivered virtually, but we encouraged people to actually host house parties and Zoom into it from the house party, because the breakout sessions, there's actually a breakout session, believe it or not, with hundreds and, over thousands of people. We can do these breakout sessions, and they're important because people have to test their analysis. They have to test their ideas. And there have been some fabulous ideas coming forward given the frameworks that we're offering. So we offer frameworks of how to think about what actions are most effective. We offer examples of those. We offer specific tactics, but we encourage people to be creative about the principle of what they're trying to achieve and then how to best achieve it. So the breakouts are important. We can deliver the whole training in mass without those breakouts. But I'm also finding, Rachel, that people really do want to be in community with other people, and they want to be talking to others, and being able to play off of others is very, very useful. So we are perfecting the technology on what can allow us to have thousands of people on beyond, the current technology that we have access to. And we're doing it in person. We're also trying to figure out, since we have 31 states, and by the way, 2 countries, Austria and Canada, were also on the Zoom, the training that we did on Sunday. But we're trying to figure out now how to take the people in different states, right? We had people in Idaho calling in. How do we take all the Idaho people and group them together? And we're encouraging people to sign up for the next Resistance Lab training, because we're going to keep doing these, and to get people in their community involved, because that sense of community also helps to create kind of a bigger coordinated resistance and the sense of safety for people to be able to do things in big numbers. So we're really excited. This has just been literally 2 weeks in the making, but we have an amazing curriculum. It is replicable, and we're super excited to spread it as far as we can go. And people can go to PramilaForCongress.com to sign up.
When's the next one? When's the date? Oh, you still got me? Oh, I've lost her.
Yeah.
Congressman.
Can you hear me?
I can't. I said, when's the next one?
I'm right here.
When's the date of the next one?
I think it's going to be in 2 weeks. We haven't quite said it yet, but if you sign up right now, you will get an email. And I should mention, we have a resistance rapid response email list that sends out weekly to-dos for people, as well as a reading list to continue to deepen people's understanding.
Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal, thank you for your time. We'll be on this. We're going to cover the next one when it happens. Appreciate it. Thank you.
All right, let's talk about how Wisconsinites are taking all of this. John, you know Wisconsinites better than anyone, really. How do they feel about Elon Musk spending this much money? How do they feel about this race now being the most expensive race in history? It's not just Elon Musk. Democrats are also spending a lot of money, although the money is a bit more diverse than just one man. How's it going over?
People are disgusted. There's no question of that. They have seen more negative ads than in anything but the kind of the worst moments of the presidential race. The television airwaves are literally filled with ads saying that both candidates are essentially evil, and the mailings are flying at a level that you can't believe. What's happened is that people have gone into their camps. I think that for Democrats and progressives, and remember, this is a nonpartisan race officially, but for Democrats and progressives, they're very excited about Susan Crawford, who is a judge, a longtime prosecutor, somebody who they see as a person of the law, who, if this person got elected, would keep a progressive majority on the court. For the Republicans, of course, they like their candidate, Brad Schimmel, a longtime Republican politician who is very, very enthusiastic about Donald Trump. The thing that's really shaken the race up and made it different than some of the previous Supreme Court races in Wisconsin, which have had their partisan edge, is that Elon Musk has inserted himself into the race. Not recently. He started doing this in January. And the fascinating thing about it is he doesn't know Wisconsin at all. He literally at one point in this nonpartisan race where the words Republican and Democrat aren't on the ballot said vote for the Republican. Yesterday, he referred to Brad Schimmel, who is not a Supreme Court justice, as Justice Schimmel. And so you have to ask yourself, what's going on here? And I think a lot of Wisconsinites are. The answer is that Elon Musk wants a right-wing court in Wisconsin. He thinks that would be beneficial to Donald Trump at the national level. And frankly, Elon Musk has a lawsuit in Wisconsin trying to overturn some Wisconsin laws as regards the selling of vehicles like Teslas. And there are certainly progressives, people like Susan Crawford, who have speculated that he wouldn't mind having a court that was friendly to his business.
Cornel, the Democrats are trying to go after Elon Musk in this race, and even Schimmel didn't appear with Elon Musk at this event in Green Bay over the weekend. Is that the successful tactic here, to make this about Elon Musk, not necessarily about Donald Trump?
Look, I think the conservatives are going to look at what Elon Musk is doing here and think, you know, this was a race that we like our chances better if one of a deeply unpopular billionaire does not Bigfoot his way into this race and become the center of this race, right? He is literally overshadowing all the other issues, and even the candidate, as the last panelist was talking about here. And let's look, you know, Elon Musk is someone who, in our own NBC polling, is shown to be unpopular, and particularly unpopular with the middle of the road voters. And to a certain extent, he symbolizes the story that many Democrats want to drive. The narrative they want to drive is that this is a government, and the Republicans are people who are owned and operate by and for the very wealthy and special interests of this country. You know, he completely encapsulates that. So, Katie, what possibly could go wrong when the person that the narrative that the Democrats want to drive, the person who better encapsulates that has, you know, made his way into the race and is actually overshadowing the more conservative candidate, because to that point, it's not a Dem versus Republican race, at least not on the ballot.
You know, it's not just Elon Musk, and we can talk about larger issues here, but we've now had more than 2 months of Donald Trump, and I listed them at the top of the show, all of the ways that he's trying to remake government, all the moves he's made. They've been fast and furious, to use a cliche. One of the big things, Christine, is tariffs. Tariffs are really eating into people's optimism for the future, I think we can say, before they're eating into paychecks. The tariffs with Canada, the tariffs with Europe, China, Mexico, the retaliatory tariffs. How might that play in Wisconsin?
It might play in Wisconsin, the retaliation, because this is what a trade war is. You know, the United States puts on tariffs, and then you get all of these threats from other countries saying, OK, well, we're going to raise import taxes on what you send us. So think motorcycles, Menominee Falls, Wisconsin. Anyone? Think dairy, think poultry, think grains. These are all things that are made there in the Midwest. So those producers will feel Donald Trump's trade war. And I think that all consumers will feel the trade war. We know the automakers are warning that prices will likely rise for cars. Let me game this out for you. If prices rise for cars, consumers are already exhausted, and suddenly they're not buying as many cars, they're buying used cars, then the factories don't have to run as many shifts. And then you've got auto workers who then are not getting the hours they want. So all of this can sort of play out, and I feel like a lot of people in Wisconsin and elsewhere will feel it in a matter of weeks.
A prominent Yale professor who studies fascism is leaving the U.S. amid the Trump administration's crackdown on universities and colleges. Jason Stanley, author of How Fascism Works, The Politics of Us and Them, is departing the hallowed Ivy League school to teach in Toronto, telling a philosophy website the reason is, quote, entirely because of the political climate in the United States. This comes as the Trump administration threatens to withhold funding for preeminent institutions like Columbia, which capitulated to the administration over so-called security reforms. And as grad students from Columbia and Tufts are among scholars now detained by immigration enforcement after their involvement in pro-Palestinian protests or riots. Professor and author Jason Stanley joins us now. Professor, thanks for taking the time with us. You cited the current political environment in this country as why you're leaving, why you're heading to Canada. Is it impeding you from teaching what and how you'd want to teach?
Oh, absolutely not. Yale has, to this extent, protected its scholars, unlike Columbia, who forced, for example, Catherine Frank, a prominent law professor, into early retirement. So it has nothing to do with me. It has everything to do with my children and my desire to send a warning to Americans that is consonant with the work I've been doing.
You talk about Columbia submitting to the White House's demands after the threats to withhold federal funding. I mean, some of what they agreed to are new rules for protests, more security officers that can make arrests, new leadership to oversee certain academic programs like Middle East studies. You called Columbia's capitulation a warning. How so?
Well, Americans don't really understand some of the details. They put the department, never before has the federal government intervened to put a department into receivership, much less an excellent department like the Department of Middle Eastern Studies at Columbia University. And it's not new leadership. They're going to appoint perhaps a non-academic, it's someone who's obviously going to intervene in academic affairs. They're very serious about this. Receivership is only meant for when professors in a department dislike each other so much they can't be in the same room together. And needless to say, this crackdown, Columbia's capitulation to this is a grave sign about the future of academic freedom, in addition to, say, hauling people off the street and sending them to Louisiana prisons like they did at Tufts University for co-authoring op-eds in the student newspaper.
Yeah, I mean, it's Tufts, it's Columbia, Georgetown, the University of Minnesota. I mean, we keep learning of new cases of grad students or other academics being detained by ICE. And I'll note that these are people who are here legally. They have permanent residence. They're, on student visas. Secretary of State Marco Rubio said last week that these cases are just the beginning. What is the message this administration is sending by detaining these scholars and prioritizing this sort of a crackdown?
The message is that they're going to do a kind of stochastic terrorism against our country. They're going to target people one by one so that those who are in fear will shut up, essentially. And universities are filled with fear already. They're ceasing to make public statements. They're not banding together. Right now, they're targeting non-citizens for, writing in student newspapers. I'm sure, or I suspect, they'll start pulling people's passports, targeting U.S. citizens for various reasons, and exploiting Americans' ignorance. Generally, we don't know about each other's workplaces, exploiting Americans' ignorance about academic freedom, and they're trying to, and I fear they will succeed in destroying America's higher education system, which is by far the best in the world.
I wonder, there are probably people watching this right now thinking, well, you have a lot to say. You are an American citizen. Why not stay and try to be the change you're seeking? Why not be part of the pushback to this sort of behavior?
I will continue to throw punches against fascism and bullies from Canada. Don't worry. I have 2 Black and Jewish kids. I think my kids actually are more important to me than anything else. So They're using my religion to go after academic freedom, crushing universities supposedly in the name of protecting my people, American Jews. My kids are Jewish. My kids are black. They're attacking their history. And I want to send a political message, as I've been doing with my work. This comes at great personal cost. This is not some, I'm taking a huge salary cut. I'm not a super wealthy person. I'll still be well paid, but I'm taking like a 25% salary cut, removing myself from my homeland that I love. And I love America because it doesn't have kings. I don't love America because we can punch other people in the nose.
And so we're seeing President Trump consolidate power, pushing to quiet dissent, pressuring law firms and universities, detaining scholars. He's also attacking the judiciary and any judges who block or question his policies. How would you describe this moment for America?
It is a brutal attack on America's freedoms. It's an attack specifically on our democratic institutions, the legal system, the courts and universities, and the media. And these institutions the media has been attacking universities for a decade. They've been doing Trump's work for him. So that doesn't help when the democratic institutions are working against each other. And each of these institutions, in the face of this attack on democracy and this attack on freedom by a ruler who's completely saying he wants to be a king, and a political party that's behaving like communist China and lining up 100% against him. In the face of this, universities are turning on each other, are saying, oh, we don't want to be in the public, we're going to hide under the table. So law firms stealing each other's clients. So it's not a positive development, and I'm going to continue calling it out from the University of Toronto.
Jason Stanley, let's keep in touch. Thank you very much for being on our show and providing your perspective and some expertise as well. We appreciate it.
In the weekend phone call with NBC's Kristen Welker, President Trump made several comments regarding Vladimir Putin and Russia, referring to reporting on Friday that Putin suggested a transitional government be put in place in Ukraine. Trump said that made him, quote, very angry, adding that's not going in the right direction. He reportedly went even further, telling Welker that if a broad ceasefire deal isn't reached and he feels as if it's Russia's fault, he will put secondary sanctions on the country. Put that thought on hold for a second. Jonathan Lemire, you had something to say about the tariffs, and then we're going to turn to Richard on Russia.
Yeah, just one final beat on the tariffs. As of last night, senior White House aides, including Kevin Hassert, who's like the head of the Economic Council, they do not know what tariffs are coming on Liberation Day, Wednesday, Donald Trump's day, because so much of this is going to be Trump's last minute, his whims, his last minute decision, and his personal feelings are clearly going to be involved here. So adding to Frank's point earlier about the instability, how no one can, markets, businesses, no one can plan because nothing has been settled yet. So that is another piece here as we're watching.
So now back to Russia, Richard, and I'll just take that. Well, at some point, what Liberation Day means, actually, what that means, and the use of that phrase itself, in so many ways, has some other meanings. But tell us a little bit about these specific comments that Donald Trump has made about Putin. What do they tell you? And do they ultimately, in the big picture, mean anything?
Look, the good news is the president, for the first time, evidenced some frustration with Vladimir Putin, who's clearly stalling.
Yeah.
Putin has rejected the 30-day unconditional ceasefires, putting out all sorts of other ideas with all sorts of conditions. He is not serious about bringing this war to an end because he believes time is his friend. He believes Russia is gaining a little bit of territory, and he knows that U.S. support for Ukraine down the road is uncertain. So Putin wants to test that. The problem with what the president said is he has the wrong remedy. The answer is not secondary sanctions. That essentially means you would sanction China, India, and Turkey, the three biggest importers of Russian energy. So we'd create bilateral issues with all of them without really having a significant impact on Russia's economy. We want to change Vladimir Putin's calculus. It's not that hard. What we need to do is announce that U.S. support for Ukraine with military support and intelligence support will go on indefinitely so Ukraine can defend itself. This takes away from Putin the argument that time's on his side.
Right.
This means we will support Ukraine. And if you do get to a ceasefire, we still need to support Ukraine. Why? Because Russia's going to continue to produce arms and get ready. We don't want a ceasefire to be temporary. We want a cessation of hostilities to be permanent. The only way I know how to do this, Mika, is for the United States to step up and essentially keep the spigot open. We can argue about how much and so forth, and to defend Ukraine. It's not going to liberate Crimea, but the United States needs to be steadfast in its support for Ukraine. That is the signal that Donald Trump needs to send to Vladimir Putin. Then he actually increases the chance of getting this peace he so properly wants. But right now, he has the right idea, but he's going about it in exactly the wrong way.
President Emeritus of the Council on Foreign Relations, Richard Haass. Thank you. Jonathan.
Yeah, so Anne Applebaum, it is, as Richard said, encouraging, I suppose, that President Trump, for once, has a crossword for President Putin. I guess my first question to you is simply, do you believe him? And my second is, okay, let's say that's the case. Everything in these pre-negotiations right now, the White House has sided with Russia, sided with their negotiation stance, made Ukraine be the one to suggest there'll be concessions. So if it's not, Richard says secondary sanctions, that's not going to get it done. So if actually we do believe President Trump wants to get this done and is willing to be tough with Russia, what does that look like?
So first of all, this story reminds me of the Oscar Wilde quote about second marriages. It's a triumph of hope over experience. This is actually the fourth time that Trump has threatened Putin with sanctions or with something. And I would also draw your attention to something he said a little bit later, getting onto Air Force One yesterday. He said, I don't think he's going to go back on his word about Putin. He said, you're talking about Putin, and I've known him for a long time. So I would have some doubts about whether this is the case. I mean, it is, of course, true that the Russians are blocking a ceasefire. They don't want one. They still think they're going to win the war, either militarily or through diplomacy. And, as Richard Haass says, the only real answer to this, the only one that makes any sense, is to present them with, an unshakable, decision with us and our allies to continue supporting Ukraine so that the Russians don't win. And it's only when they conclude that they can't win that they'll stop the war. I just don't know whether President Trump sees that yet or not.
Yeah, I was just returned from Europe, and I was talking, Mika, to political scientists in Germany who spend a lot of their time watching the situation in Ukraine, and they're pretty despondent about the chances for any deal for Ukraine that doesn't look, as they put it to me, either a bad deal or a very bad deal. At this point, coming from the White House, they just don't see Donald Trump wanting to put that kind of pressure, whatever he said this weekend. And as Anne said, it's not the first time that he has said things like this, threats like this against Putin. He just doesn't follow up on them. In the end, he sides with Putin over Zelensky and over Ukraine. So let's see what happens there. But the mood certainly in Europe about Ukraine is pretty gloomy at the moment.
Well, like what Anne Applebaum is writing about, the Hungarian model, there's a lot of things happening at once, a lot of pressure points.